Tim Winton, a pleasure to have you on the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Just read The Shepherd's Hut, story of Jaxie Clacton, this young boy who, I'm not going to give the story away, but something happens and it starts his own journey. And I suppose it's a journey of all boys into men, what it is to be a man. Is that what you were talking about here? He's an example of all of us.
Yeah, I only really understood that after I'd finished the book. I was just writing about this particular
character,
this particular 15-year-old who doesn't exist. But in retrospect, yeah, I think this is a kid who's on this great trek across the salt lands. You know, he's running from something and he's running to something else. But he's on his way to adulthood, and like a lot of boys, like a lot of young men, he's overarmed and underbriefed.
There's a wonderful passage here. I'm just going to read this because there is a relationship between his father and him, which is a volatile relationship and is the trigger for the journey that he takes. Fact is, I've met dogs smarter than the man my mother married, and I've had a long time to wonder how he got like he was. Maybe he was born like that. But do people start out vicious? It really goes to this question of what happens to a man, and we are talking about men specifically here, what happens to a man to distort that character? Born like that? Do they start out vicious, or does something else happen?
Yeah, it's a tough question. My feeling is that boys are born wild, as are girls, and that's a great thing, and it's something to celebrate. That feral openness, that's, you know, just that I love that wildness in children. But some boys become savages, and that's from training. I don't think that's necessarily innate. I think either by indulgence or neglect, they're trained to become savage. They're encouraged to narrow their spectrum of emotions, their spectrum of attitude and behaviour, and they're sort of enlisted in the army of misogyny. Almost so you get tenderness squeezed out of them.
That's a beautiful line. You use that line in this speech about masculinity. Have the tenderness squeezed out of them. Who's done that to boys? What's lacking?
I think we all do it. I don't think it's necessarily a personal transaction. I think there's some sort of systemic action involved. I think the culture is still subject to this sort of undertow of patriarchy and misogyny. I think these kind of attitudes, you know, simple attitudes like, you know, this fundamental notion that a woman has to give and a man has to take.
This is a recurring theme in your work, isn't it? I was thinking about that after reading Shepherd's Hut, that there is a man or a boy who is damaged, and there's an event that creates the damage, and there is a journey to that healing, and there's always, as there is in this book, a woman there as well, who often presents the other side of that healing. This is an eternal story, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think this idea, I mean, you get old enough where you start to see the script is so obvious and it's so endlessly repeated.
But you keep going back to it, so obviously you're still struggling to resolve this.
I think so, because I think
idea.
I'm in my 50s. I'm a grandparent, and you see the script hasn't changed sufficiently. I mean, we're more conscious of the need for change and for men in particular to change, but the change is so slow that in your own lifetime we'd still be subject to these forces, this sort of gender imprinting, this kind of modelling, and so many boys are learning how to be men from people who are really bad at being men.
Yeah, the first fight, the first beer, who you look up to, you know, the football, the surf, whatever it is, not necessarily the best environment.
Yeah, we have no, you know, boys don't have very defined rites of passage in our culture anymore, and I just think it's sad. I think boys often just put themselves together from spare parts, and and what's closest to hand is often cheap and defective, and that makes it's dangerous. You know, they're learning how to be bad men because there aren't enough good men in their lives showing them how to be good men.
It's not something that any of us really escape. I mean, we all have to deal with this. We all have to find what it is to be a man, and that's constantly changing. What about yourself? You talk about being enlisted into misogyny, those things that you've spoken about that squeeze the tenderness out of you. You've written about your own life and your own boyhood and those moments when the fork in the road appears for you, potentially a violent one. How have you struggled with that yourself?
I think you're conscious that, you know, misogyny, you know, overwhelmingly it's, you know, the people who suffer from it are women, girls and women. There's no getting around that. But I think we often forget that men also suffer from misogyny. It narrows their lives. It offers you fewer pathways, and you're under this pressure to be only one kind of man.
One of the things you've spoken about to try to create the capacity for men to find a better part of themselves, to grow, is ritual. Is that what's lacking? You know, rites of passage, initiation that is positive, the ritual, and if so, where do you see that coming from?
Well, that's a good question. I wish I knew the answer to that. I guess I just got old enough to see that we had scraped away in Middle Australia, at the very least, ritual pathways to manhood. A point at which a boy could be, you know, led to a stage where, you know, afterwards he could be recognised as a man. And I've travelled and seen
traditional societies have this.
Absolutely, and none more more eloquent than those that are homegrown. I mean, Australian Indigenous cultures and peoples are still doing it, and so I know people have been through the law, and they have a point at which they are unequivocally recognised in their family and their clan as a man. But it has a bedrock. It's culture and spirituality, and I think we're still suffering in the mainstream Australia about those two things. We're uncertain of our culture, and we're awkward about spirituality. And I think I suspect that in order to find some ways towards ritual pathways to manhood, we might have to re-engage with some of those other things. The market isn't going to do it for us.
Tim, it's a pleasure to speak to you. The book was terrific. Enjoyed it so much. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks.